The relationship with Israel is in a different league entirely. The lobby's fingerprints are all over our relationship with Iran. If you knock off one or two congressmen this way, that sends a message to everybody else that it's not smart, that if you want to get reelected, this is not an issue you want to cross them on. And that's how a lobby can exert lots of impact on a president, even when the president knows that the policies they're pushing are not what he wants, not in the best interest of the country.
Stephen Walt is a renowned American scholar and a leading U.S. foreign policy expert. He's also a Harvard professor of international relations and a columnist with Foreign Policy. In 2007, he famously co-authored a book with John Mearsheimer titled The Israel Lobby and U.S. Foreign Policy, which generated a lot of buzz and controversy for challenging what has been a taboo topic in the U.S. for decades. So today, in light of Israel's war in Gaza, Lebanon, and the escalation with Iran, we're going to be discussing the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. And he joins us now from Vienna. Professor Stephen Walt, thank you so much for coming on Real Talk. Appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure.
I'm just going to dive right into it, Professor. You recently retweeted a clip of Daniel Levy. It was a Daniel Levy interview in which he said, those who are suggesting that this will be a mission accomplishment moment that will somehow lead us to a ceasefire haven't been paying attention. Netanyahu isn't at war with Sinwar or Hamas. Israel is at war with the Palestinian people. And shortly after, Netanyahu did state that Sinwar's death does not signal an end to the war. So if we can just start with your thoughts there.
Well, I think Daniel and I both had a similar thought that what was happening in the Middle East, and in particular what Israel was doing, and then eventually the assassination of Sinwar, was somewhat reminiscent of the famous mission accomplished moment when George W. Bush, landed on an aircraft carrier after the fall of Iraq and declared that the American invasion was a great success. And of course, that's what it looked like at that moment. But we know with the passage of time, this was a tragedy both for Iraq, but also, of course, for the United States and others. It was not a victory, that the hard part lay ahead. And I think, you saw Israelis, and in particular Netanyahu, sort of giving themselves high fives at this great achievement and all that they have now accomplished, and thinking that they are in the process of remaking the Middle East, much the same way that George W. Bush thought he was going to remake the entire Middle East. But it's not going to work. It's not likely to achieve that aim. And I think a few years from now, we'll look back on that moment as having made nothing better, and perhaps made many things much worse.
I'm going to get to that question a bit later, but what are your biggest concerns right now from the moment that we're in?
I think there's some danger still that the war is going to get bigger, there's I think a very real possibility of an Israeli attack on Iran. We don't know how successful or how extensive that's going to be. Of course, one cannot help but be alarmed by the humanitarian consequences here, the number of innocent civilians that have been killed, first in Gaza, initially first in Israel, then in Gaza in large numbers, now in Lebanon, and this may not be over yet. It's pretty clear now that at least some Israelis have the idea of trying to expel Palestinians permanently from Gaza, possibly permanently from the West Bank again. And that, of course, will have enormous humanitarian consequences if it occurs. And then if you think sort of longer term, right, it seems to me what's happening vis-a-vis Israel and Iran is going to strengthen the hand of Iranians who think it's time for them to finally go forward and develop an actual nuclear weapon, as opposed to just acquiring the capability to do so at some point if they wish to. So you put all those things together and you can imagine a much worse Middle East a few years from now. Now, this also has consequences for the United States, right? It's done enormous damage to America's standing in the world, exposing much of the hypocrisy behind our moral posturing. It has been a giant distraction for the Biden administration. You just think of the amount of time, effort, bandwidth they have spent dealing with this conflict, which of course prevents them from dealing with lots of other events around the world. It's a great boon to China, which can point to this whole event and say, this is what happens when the United States tries to run a region. Wouldn't it be better if we had a multipolar world where power was shared and the United States wasn't able to do things like this. And that's an argument that's going to appeal to many people. That's not good for the United States. And if I wanted to be parochial for a minute, I'd throw in, it may still cost Kamala Harris the election.
Do you think that, because you have written an article endorsing her the other day, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this specific point.
Well, I mean, we'll know on November 6th, I hope, what the outcome is there, but it's clearly undermined her standing among Democratic progressives. It's alienated Arab American populations, which are substantial in a couple of key states, especially Michigan. And if the election comes down to, a few thousand votes in Michigan, for example, then a plausible case could be made that this has hurt them. Again, this is all somewhat speculative, but I think it's hard to see how this is good for anybody in the region, right? It's not good, obviously, for the Palestinians. It's ultimately, I think, going to do enormous harm to Israel. It's a tragedy for Lebanon. It's, obviously bad for Iran as well. And it's harming the United States, which makes it surprising that the United States has not done more to try and bring this to an end.
One of the things that I really wanted to delve into today is to really talk about the special relationship between the U.S. and Israel. Obviously, the two countries have one of the closest relationships between any two countries in history. Now, you argue in your book that this special relationship is largely due to the influence of the pro-Israel lobby in the U.S. But if we go back to the basics of it all, to really try to just break it down, I mean, why does the U.S. give unconditional diplomatic, economic, and military support to Israel?
Well, two things to say. I mean, you're absolutely right that this is a relationship that really has no precedent, no equal. The United States has had close ties with a number of other countries over many years. You think of the American relationship with Great Britain, at least in the 20th century, not before the 20th century, but as a very close and intimate relationship. But even there, the United States was willing to play hardball with Great Britain in a number of occasions. After World War II, helping dismantle the British Empire, insisting that we would design the global economy after the war, not Great Britain. So we were willing to criticize Britain and put real pressure on them, despite the fact that we had a very close relationship. The relationship with Israel is in a different league entirely. And as you said, it's one where, first of all, the United States provides very generous support. Roughly $4 billion of military aid. And of course, since the war in Gaza, we've provided over $18 billion worth of additional assistance. And this, by the way, is going to a country that's actually a relatively wealthy country. It's in the top 25 in per capita income in the world. So it's not like the United States is providing all this assistance to a poor country that desperately needs it. We're providing it to a relatively rich country that has the most powerful military in the region and also has nuclear weapons. That's unusual when you think it. But the thing that's really unusual about it is the unconditional nature. It gets its aid no matter what it does.
Right.
So over the past year, but this is also true many years in the past, Israeli leaders have routinely ignored American requests, American pleas, American pressure to try and get them to alter their behavior. And no matter what they do, the United States continues to provide this assistance. It also provides them with diplomatic protection, vetoing UN Security Council resolutions that are critical of Israel. The Biden administration insisting that what's happening in Gaza is not a genocide, and saying that what the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice have ruled is wrong. This is diplomatic support that other countries don't expect.
Providing cover, essentially.
Yeah, so again, there's really no daylight. And then finally, although this has changed some in recent years, it used to be almost impossible to find any American politicians who would say a critical word about Israel, no matter what it was doing. It would happen occasionally, rather softly, but by and large, Israel got enormous support. And that's very puzzling. No other country in the world was in the same position. And our view, of course, was this was largely due to the influence of a coalition of groups that we called the Israel Lobby, whose main mission is to try and maintain that special relationship of unconditional support.
To try to understand the significance of this from a realist point of view, I mean, your approach to even write the book back in 2007, or co-write the book in 2007, I guess the subject is what? We have a domestic lobby that, in a way, is disrupting U.S. fixed interests. So why is that significant from a realist point of view?
Well, realists tend to think that states do have national interests, and they tend to pursue them pretty rationally, that they try to do things that are to their own benefit, that'll leave them in a better position. And our argument was that our Middle East policy and our unconditional support for Israel was an exception to that. It was a case where it was not actually helping the United States advance its national interests. And especially now, you could make a case that it was good for the United States during the Cold War, but after the Cold War, it was increasingly clear that it was a real handicap for the United States. So this is clearly an exemption or an anomaly for a realist. And our argument was, therefore, you have to look elsewhere for the explanation being, in this case, domestic politics. I just add two other points, though. I mean, one of the reasons the United States can do this is because it is so powerful and so secure. If your security is more precarious, if you have to think more carefully about what you're doing in the world, you can't indulge policies like this one for as long as the United States has. The second thing a realist would say is, look, you can do things that aren't in your interest, but if you do, you're going to pay a price. And I would argue that the United States has paid a considerable price for the special relationship. But because we're so big and powerful, we've been willing to do that because most Americans don't fully understand how much it's actually costing them.
If we look at this from the prism of everything that's happening in Gaza today, again, this is a criticism that you've been subjected to over the years, but the idea that is it not simplistic to look at this special relationship being built on just one element, i.e. the all-powerful lobby? And again, going back to what's happening in Gaza, looking at it from that prism, doesn't that really absolve any American agency in this? I mean, where is the military-industrial complex, for example, American lawmakers, the foreign policy blob, which you have written about extensively as well?
Well, I don't think there's really a contradiction here at all. First of all, I wouldn't say that Israel lobby is all powerful, right? There are times when it loses, it doesn't get absolutely everything it wants. It's just has the most profound influence on Middle East policy of any organization. I mean, there are parts of the military-industrial complex that aren't opposed to what we're doing here because they can, some of the weapons that we provide to Israel are from Lockheed Martin and other companies, and they don't care where the weapons go. Of course, at other points in the past, the defense contractors were actually bothered by the lobby. When Boeing wanted to sell AWACS aircrafts to Saudi Arabia, the Reagan administration had a huge fight on its hands to get that sale approved, and largely because they were opposed by AIPAC and others. So, those other groups can play a role, but it's, I think, abundantly clear that the overwhelming influence on U.S. policy in the region is, again, this set of pro-Israel groups like AIPAC, also to include more recently so-called Christian Zionists or Christian evangelicals, and a number of other groups and organizations as well. It's not just one single organization that's exerting this influence.
But you would argue that what's happening today is actually against U.S. interests.
Absolutely. It's hard to see how the United States is more secure, more prosperous, or more respected around the world when it is actively supporting the actions that Israel is taking in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere. It's hard to, and it's interesting to note that the Biden administration almost never tries to justify what we're doing on those grounds. You don't hear Blinken go in front of the cameras and explain why this is good for America. Right. He doesn't bother to make that argument because it's almost impossible to make.
And it leads to a very consistent question is, okay, if it's against U.S. interests, why isn't the U.S. reeling Israel in? Like, why isn't the U.S. actually putting a stop to this?
Well, I think one of the things we're seeing here is, in some respects, the culmination of the lobby's success over many years, even many decades, in building a very positive image of Israel in the United States and making it almost a reflexive habit for politicians to support it. And I think Joe Biden's views are a perfect example of this. This is a guy who was in the Senate for decades, who has been absorbing AIPAC talking points his entire political career, who's been to Israel a number of times, knows a lot of the officials, and he has an image of Israel that's shaped by this effort to convey it as the only democracy in the Middle East, a land, a country that is making the desert bloom, et cetera, that has always been our closest ally, et cetera. And I think he genuinely believes this.
Right.
It's an outdated view. It leaves out the more depressing or sordid side of Israeli history, but he doesn't really believe that or doesn't really recognize how out of sync his view of Israel and its relationship to the Palestinians really is.
I just want to elaborate on that point. You're saying that the Biden administration or Biden himself have an outdated view of Israel today.
Yes. Right. I don't think, I think that's not true of every single member of the Biden administration.
Sure.
But I think Biden and probably to a great extent Blinken do still have this rather romantic view of Israel pre-1967 even, that just doesn't conform to reality in any significant way. So part of this has been for American politicians and even for many Americans, shaping an image of Israel is very positive, where it gets sort of the benefit of the doubt. They're seen by many Americans as the good guys. And it's worth remembering, of course, that most Americans don't pay much attention to foreign affairs, don't have a deep knowledge of the history of the region, are easily, influenced or swayed by sort of popular images and views of this. And all of that makes it very different or very difficult, again, until somewhat recently, for Americans to think bad things about Israel or to think that it might be doing something wrong. That's why the Gaza war, although not the first example of this kind of behavior, but that's why the Gaza war, I think, has been so telling, that this is a case where suddenly many Americans can actually see what's happening. And they don't support Hamas. They agree, as I do, that what happened on October 7th was horrific. But they watch what the reaction has been, watch the glee with which some Israelis are cheering this on. They see what's happening on the West Bank, something that had nothing to do with the October 7th attacks. And now they see what's happening in Lebanon. And that's making them wake up to the fact that this ally in the Middle East is acting in a completely brutal and indefensible fashion. And of course, that leads them to question what they've been told. That's certainly leading them to question what the Biden administration is telling them. So an event like this, I think, ultimately has a very corrosive effect on many American attitudes. And that's not likely to change.
Another thing I want to get to, because I think this begets another question about how this war is being viewed. One poll from the Arab Center, Washington, found that 76% of public opinion in the Arab world has become more negative of the U.S. following the war. And just from that statistic, how do we not see this as America's war?
Well, I think it's not entirely America's war, but it's not at all surprising to me that that's how Arab populations have reacted to this. Among other things, not only are they just horrified by the humanitarian effects here, by the deaths and suffering, and what's going to continue and undoubtedly get worse. And I would just add, what we know about what's happened is undoubtedly just a small amount of what the actual damage is, because it's impossible to monitor entirely or measure exactly what's happening. But among other things, what Arab populations have every reason to ask themselves is, if the United States is willing to tolerate this and in fact continue to arm and supply Israel with the means to do this, then isn't it likely that the United States would be willing to tolerate Israel doing this to us? That is to say, even if I'm not in Gaza, I have to think that America would be willing to go along if the United States decided to support Israel attacking someone else. So Arabs have a reason to worry about this.
And they're seeing that in Lebanon.
Yes, they're seeing it in Lebanon. They're seeing it with the attacks on the Houthis. as well. And again, you can think of various reasons why that might be justifiable. The Houthis were attacking shipping, etc. But all of this gives Arab populations a reason to see the United States as fundamentally hostile, or at least not very interested in their interests or their concerns, because, again, we're doing so much to facilitate what Israel is doing. And, American officials will keep saying that, well, we don't want these things to happen. And my view on this is if you don't want somebody to do something, you don't give them the means to do it. And that, unfortunately, is what we've been doing.
I want to go back to, we were talking about how in the Cold War, Israel was viewed as a strategic asset. And this is an example that I'm sure you've come across. It's been brought up in previous conversations, but I will read you a quote by Ronald Reagan. This was when Israel was bombing Beirut in 1982. And Reagan gave a call to the Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Menachem Begin, to ask him to end the bombing. And this is me quoting Reagan. I was angry. I told him it had to stop, for our entire future relationship was in danger. I used the word Holocaust deliberately and said the symbol of his war was becoming a picture of a 7-month-old baby with its arms blown off. Reagan was always pro-Israel, but it does seem that that approach towards Arab states or Arab life was different. And that reality isn't the same today. I mean, is this basically the result of the lobby influencing policy the last few decades? Or is basically that influence what we're seeing embodied today by the Biden administration? Or is that just a result of the Cold War and the equation has now tilted and, Arab life no longer has the same value as it used to, for example?
I'm not sure. I don't have a good answer to that question. I'm aware of the episode, back in the Reagan administration. And of course, Reagan, as you say, was a very staunchly pro-Israel president. I do think that within Washington, the opinion, certainly in circles of power, has become more solidified around a pro-Israel consensus. And I don't know if that's a consequence of the war on terror, sort of altering views as well. I don't know if that's a function of, with the Trump administration sort of giving Netanyahu whatever he wanted as well. I don't have myself a completely convincing explanation for why the Biden administration has been so quiescent, so compliant. Certainly, it's worth remembering, though, that the Republican Party has become staunchly pro-Israel. It didn't used to be. The Republican Party, interestingly enough, the parties have shifted to some degree. Democratic Party used to be sort of lock, stock, and barrel pro-Israel. And there were some Republicans who would occasionally, express reservations for various reasons. That's changed now. Now we have a situation where the Republican Party, I think partly for AIPAC-related reasons and partly for Christian evangelical reasons, is completely devoted to Israel. And most of the Democratic Party, especially the old guard in the Democratic Party, is pretty staunchly pro-Israel. What you see now is breakdowns primarily in the Democratic Party, where younger Democrats, certainly younger progressives, are much less supportive, even in a few cases, quite critical as well. But I confess, I still find it slightly baffling, not that the Biden administration has basically been on Israel's side in all of this, but that they have been so quiescent, so unwilling to put any meaningful pressure now for over a year to try and bring this to an end. And what's really puzzling about it, of course, is if they thought about it for very long, they might realize that this is actually doing enormous long-term harm to Israel. So if you claim to be pro-Israel and you're backing a set of policies that are damaging the country, you're not helping at all. It's sort of like, giving your teenager the keys to the car after he's smashed the first one. So you give him the keys again, he smashes it again, and you give him the keys to a third car as well. That's not an act of love. That's an act of carelessness or something worse. If I search for an explanation for this, I think part of it does have to do with the fact that we are in an election year in the United States. presidential election year that many people think is absolutely critical, and where it's a neck and neck race. And under those circumstances, I believe the Biden administration, made a calculation. They knew they would pay a political price either way. They knew they would pay a price if they put a lot of pressure on Israel. That was going to cost them campaign contributions. That was going to get them criticized by AIPAC and a number of other groups. They would lose some support on Capitol Hill, including some support from Democrats. So they'd pay a price that way. But they also understood they were going to pay a price with progressives and with Arab Americans if they went the other way. I think they made that calculation and decided to go the familiar route. Right. And it was especially true, of course, when Biden was going to be the candidate, because he really is, sort of reflexively Zionist. But I think that, this might have played itself out very differently if it was the first or second year of a presidential term and not the last year looking at an election.
And how are you making sense of the ramifications of American hypocrisy being exposed, as we touched on earlier? Calling for a ceasefire, but not really doing anything to stop it, sending $20 billion in military aid, sending an advanced missile system, U.S. troops. The idea that American hypocrisy has been exposed in the war. How are you making sense of it?
Most people understand that states aren't 100% pure, and they're going to do things occasionally that are contrary to their principles. And we all understand that there's a certain amount of hypocrisy that goes on as part of international politics. The problem is when it gets extreme. And the United States suffers from the fact that we try to present ourselves always as the world's most moral country. It's the country that's the standard bearer for human rights and, love and peace and what we like to call the rules-based order and things like that. And by putting ourselves in that position, when we fall short, then, of course, others have every reason to criticize us, and they do and should. Now, when the violation is as extreme as this is, when the hypocrisy is so apparent, and when it's so easily contrasted with, say, the American position on Ukraine, where we never stop criticizing Russia for what it's doing in Ukraine, perfectly understandably, in my view. And then that's compared to our attitude towards Israel, where in one case, we're opposing horrible actions, and in another case, we're supporting horrible actions. It's not surprising that other states, point this out. And what this means, of course, is that it becomes harder over time for the United States to persuade others to follow our lead. When we try to go to, international meetings and get others on our side and isolate countries we might have disagreements with, it becomes much, much harder to do. To me, it's not an accident at all that the United States has been unable to get much support for its position on Ukraine outside of Europe. Right, and a handful of very close allies in Asia. Most of the rest of the world sees no reason to get involved in that fight and doesn't think if it's a moral issue. If it was a moral issue, you'd think the United States would also be taking a similar position with respect to the conflict now happening in the Middle East. So, hypocrisy and it's not easy to measure. But when it's as extreme as it is, I think in this case, it's clear to me that the United States does pay a price. I would add one other thing that we occasionally don't talk about, and that is that, we tend to think of international politics as something that's being done by, rational people making strategic calculations. But I do think emotion and anger plays a role here. And what we're doing
What about racism?
Well, we can get to that in a second, but what I'm thinking about is the anger that people see when they watch what's happening. They get angry. This offends their sense of morality and ethics, and they're angry at the people who are doing it. They're angry at Israel, and they're angry at us for supporting it. And I think one doesn't want to underestimate, the extent of that anger and how that lingers. And that, future American leaders are going to pay a price for this. And that's leaving aside the entire question of whether or not this also over time begins to regenerate the kind of sentiments that led to the formation of Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups that caused so much trouble, 10 or 20 years ago.
The reason why I brought up racism is that I thought of a quote that Aaron Miller, the former U.S. official, gave to an American magazine, which, you know, he thinks Biden doesn't view Palestinian life the same way he views Israeli life.
I think that's pretty clear that they don't place the same weight on it. Whether or not that's overt racism or just reflects sort of deep cultural biases or the strong affinity they clearly feel for Israel. I wouldn't entirely know, but certainly if the situation was reversed, right? In other words, if you imagine a situation where say Israel had lost the Six-Day War in 1967, and that the victorious Arabs had herded the population of Israel into a portion of Israel and into the Gaza Strip and kept them there for the next 30 or 40 years. And imagine further that some of those Israelis had then formed organizations like the Stern Gang or the Irgun to resist this. Right. And eventually the Arabs got tired of this and began doing what Israel is now doing in Gaza as well. It's impossible to imagine that the United States would have tolerated that for a second. In fact, it's much easier to imagine the United States would have actively intervened with military force to rescue the Israelis that were being held in that fashion. We would have done it long ago. Right. Well, the situation is reversed now, and the United States is helping the people who are conducting the genocide. And that's, impossible or very difficult for me to swallow as an American.
The argument about Biden having an outdated view of Israel, is it possible to make that argument about the region in general? Because there has been, many accusations of a disconnect between the U.S. administration and what is actually happening on the ground in the region. And this predates October 7th as well. I mean, I think you've said before that the U.S. government gives little incentive to have a different view on the Middle East. And again, going back to when Biden was pursuing the Israel-Saudi deal quite heavily, it did seem that was some sort of last stop destination before the U.S. could kind of turn its view to China. But that clearly showed, again, that there was a huge disconnect from what's happening on the ground, particularly to Arabs and specifically the Palestinians.
Yeah, I think what you said at the end is the key here. That beginning really with the Trump administration was the idea that basically the Palestinian problem could simply be swept under the rug. And that we would do deals with Arab governments, with the Saudis, especially with MBS, who wanted to move Saudi Arabia in a new direction. And in fact, we needed to do this because if we didn't, these were countries that might start tilting towards China in various ways. So we're going to do some kind of wonderful grand bargain here. Israel can continue to develop Greater Israel. We're going to encourage normalization between Israel and the Arab states, and eventually Saudi Arabia will get on board. And we're going to create a new modernizing Middle East, problem solved. And the only problem was that left out the Palestinians entirely, totally omitted them, and assumed that there was nothing they could do, that they had no agency, they had no recourse, nothing. They would simply be ignored. And of course, they'd be abandoned by their Arab brethren, as of course they have been on many occasions in the past. And people pointed out that this wasn't going to work. It's not like people didn't say, you can't leave them out of this grand formula for a new Middle East. But the Trump people ignored that. And then the Biden people ignored it. They continued to pursue the same dream, continued to think that the Abraham Accords could then be expanded to include Saudi Arabia, and the Palestinians would simply accept their fate. What people need to understand is there are roughly the same number of Israeli Jews and Palestinian Arabs trying to share the same land, right? The land of Israel, the West Bank, and Gaza. Right. And those are roughly equal numbers there. And what we were essentially saying is that 50% of the people there have no political rights, don't need to be listened to, and will simply accept their fate forever. And essentially what the Palestinians have been given is, three options: expulsion, they can leave; extermination, they can be killed, or they can accept permanent apartheid, never have any political rights forever, right, in this land that Israel will now control. Well, if those are your only options, the fourth option, of course, is resistance, which is what Hamas was all about as well. And of course, what ultimately, I believe, triggered the October 7th attack was the Palestinian sense that if something were not done, they were going to be forgotten completely, right? So in a very real sense, the American effort, along with some others in the region, to construct a new regional order that left the Palestinian problem aside was one of the background causes of the October 7th attack that started this whole thing. Two other points. I believe that what Hamas did on October 7th involved war crimes and was illegal and should be condemned. It is also true, however, that populations under belligerent occupation, as the Palestinians are entitled to the right of resisting that occupation. They have to do so in accordance with the laws of war, which Hamas did not do. But they have the right to resist. So if Israel, as it likes to say, has the right to defend itself, Palestinians have the right to resist the occupation as well. And so I'm not going to defend what Hamas did, but we do need to understand that this history did not begin on October 7th, and it was a history of prolonged exploitation and very cruel treatment at the hands of the Israelis.
I'm going to get to American public opinion in a second, but just based on what you were saying just now, I mean, this particular moment in history, are we back to a George Bush era type thinking where the US and Israel think that they can kind of reshape the region to suit their interests?
I think certainly the Israelis, I think, are believing that now, that this is their opportunity to permanently alter the balance of power in the region and gain a free hand to complete the project of a greater Israel. They're going to, try to destroy Hamas, destroy Hezbollah, weaken Iran, weaken the rest of the so-called axis of resistance. And while the United States is distracted and divided, do as much as they can on the West Bank as well. So they see this as, I think, a moment where you can sort of alter history permanently in their favor. And I don't think it's going to work. I mean, despite all of the tactical successes and achievements you've seen over the last year or so, as well. As I said a moment ago, the Palestinians are being given no alternative, and there's no evidence that they're running up the white flag and going to accept their fate. Hamas is not defeated yet, and even if it were, new resistance organizations are going to be formed. Similarly, Iran has not given up, is continuing to resist, and dropping bombs on Iran is not going to win its population over and being more supportive of Israel. Same is true in Lebanon as well. This is also, very importantly, causing serious problems for the IDF. After a year of war, enormous internal problems with morale and things like that. Israel's increasingly isolated on the international stage. And again, something that is not commented about enough, well-educated Israelis who have alternatives are starting to leave the country in substantial numbers. And it's hard to get hard numbers on that, but they're clearly up from where they normally are. And I think most of the Israelis who have left are probably not going to go back. Surveys of Israeli expats suggest that most of them, upwards of 80%, have no real intention in going back, which means that Israel is losing the better educated people that are driving its economy, have been manning the armed forces, et cetera, and will increasingly be controlled by the sort of religious extremists we see increasingly in charge of Israeli policy. And as a long-term approach, for building a prosperous and stable society. This is a disaster.
With respect to attacking Iran, I want to ask about how the lobby is kind of operating within this framework. I mean, you've previously argued that the lobby had a key role in impacting policies that led to America's invasion of Iraq in 2003. Obviously, attacking Iran today is a moment that a lot of new conservatives in the US have been calling for. But where's the lobby in all of this?
First of all, the Israel lobby, this is actually detailed at great length in our book, a whole chapter on this, but the lobby has been trying to demonize Iran for decades, and trying to make sure that the United States and Iran never had a rapprochement or a meeting of the minds. On several occasions in the past, when Iranian leaders have reached out and tried to mend fences with the United States, AIPAC and others went into high gear to derail that, prevent it from happening. It's also worth remembering that it was AIPAC and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and a number of other lobby groups that convinced Trump to abandon the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran,
yes.
Which a completely boneheaded decision, which of course just allowed Iran to restart its nuclear program. A totally stupid decision, but of course it derailed the long-term aim of trying to improve the relationship with Iran. And these are the same groups who have repeatedly called for American military action to destroy Iran's nuclear facilities as well. So the lobby's fingerprints are all over our relationship with Iran. And of course, you'll see people now saying that, well, Iran has attacked Israel. Iran is eventually going to get nuclear weapons. The clerical regime is dead set hostile to the United States, and therefore we need to keep it weak and vulnerable and maybe try to topple it if at all possible. So they will be fully supportive of an Israeli act. Many of them would probably like the United States to be assisting that as well. So, again, I think America would have a fundamentally different Middle East policy and a fundamentally different policy towards Iran were it not for the impact of the lobby. We would have a policy much more like the policies of other major powers, say the Europeans and China, who do business with everyone. They talk to the Saudis, they talk to the Israelis, they trade with both. They talk to the Iranians, they trade with them as well. And instead of the United States, which has special relations with some countries, and especially with Israel, and no relationship at all with one of the major countries in the Middle East. This is just not smart politics.
I'm going to read you a few poll numbers here. A Data for Progress poll released in May revealed that 56% of Democrats believe Israel is committing genocide. Another one in June showed 64% of likely voters support a ceasefire and withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Among Democrats, that number was 86%. A Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll showed that 55% of Americans reject sending American troops to defend Israel if it comes under attack by its neighbors. Now, again, how do we make sense of these numbers today? This is American public opinion that has been subjected to years, if not decades, of a pro-Israeli narrative. Does public opinion even matter at this point?
Unfortunately, public opinion does not affect American foreign policy directly. I mean, it does shape it in a variety of ways, and presidents do pay attention to it. But many of the things that we have done in the past were clearly at odds with what public opinion said. But what people tell a pollster doesn't necessarily translate into actual political action, actual leverage on elected officials. They have to pay attention to it, but they can also ignore it for a long time, particularly if people don't care that much about the issue. If they care more about something else, they'll look the other way. This, by the way, is, of course, what the Harris campaign is hoping for, right? That Americans will be voting on a whole series of other issues, right, and mostly not on what's been going on in the Middle East. But there are a couple other things I'd point to as well. And this is a sort of long-term trend that for a long time, one of the things the Israel lobby did, and its other supporters in the United States, was they were trying to shape the discourse about Israel as much as possible. I mentioned this, I think, when we began, that try to create a favorable image of Israel, silence or marginalize people who are critical, and tell a positive story as much as possible. And for a long time, that worked really well. That has gotten much harder to do in the current media environment, because people don't have to just get their news from the major networks or from the Wall Street Journal or from the Washington Post to the New York Times. They can get their news online. They can get their news from Middle East Eye. They can get their news from a whole variety of sources.
Alternative media.
Yeah, and they can see lots of things for themselves on Twitter and Instagram and other forms of social media as well. They can actually see what's happening in the West Bank, in Hebron, in Lebanon, in Gaza, of course. And that means that the ability of any organization, group, or movement to control the discourse or shape everybody's understanding is diminishing. So that's one thing. It's just been much harder for the lobby to control what people see and know and understand about this. The second thing, of course, is generational change, right? There's a generation of Americans who didn't grow up with the Holocaust as part of their personal experience or in the immediate history. They didn't grow up with the founding of the State of Israel or the Six-Day War. What they've grown up with is the occupation. What they've grown up with is watching several American presidents from both political parties actually try to achieve a two-state solution, and all of them fail, largely because of opposition from Israel and opposition from the Israel lobby. So, Barack Obama was a very pro-Israel president, and he genuinely wanted to get a two-state solution, but he couldn't bring any pressure to bear because the political system wouldn't let him, and because he knew he would pay an enormous price and the lobby would inflict that on him as well. And Americans, younger than 40 have seen that, which is one of the many reasons why young Americans are much less supportive, including many younger American Jews who look at Israel, and this is not what they want to see in a state that calls itself a state of the Jewish people. So they're becoming either disaffected or in some cases openly critical, much different than the attitudes of many of their parents or other older generations. And I think that's reflected in those public opinion surveys that you cited, that public opinion would support a very different policy. But as on many other aspects of U.S. policy, not just foreign policy, what public opinion wants and what the political system generates are sometimes quite different. And that's, again, largely because of the impact of special interest groups and lobbies, whether you're talking about, healthcare or drug prices or, farm policy or, finance and Wall Street and other things as well. What the people want and what the system generates are not always the same thing.
In regards to Obama, it's interesting that you bring him up, and I'd actually like to use that example to understand of how the machinery works, or how the lobby actually influences people who run for president. Because Obama, like you said, he was pro-Israel, but he was very adamant on settlement freezes, for example. He was adamant on a two-state solution, and yet, you wrote, I think when he won his second term, you wrote that Obama caved to these groups a long time ago, and there was hardly any daylight between him and Romney on this issue, and this issue being him kind of abandoning the settlement freeze and abandoning the peace process. So how does one like Obama go from, the audacity of hope and having all these visions for the region to just being pro-Israel and abandoning key policies of his foreign policy?
Yeah, well, Obama was a pragmatic president. He wanted a second term, and he wanted to get other things accomplished. He wanted to do good things in the Middle East, and he wanted a two-state solution, but that wasn't the only thing that he wanted. And I think you can read either Ben Rhodes' memoir or the book that Peter Beinart wrote about the Obama administration, to get a pretty good picture of what was going on there. As you point out, in his first year as president, he was very outspoken about wanting to get a two-state solution. And he said, at one point in a famous speech, it was in Israel's interest, the Palestinians' interests, America's interests, and the world's interests. And he was dead right in that. But to do that, he then tried to put real pressure on Netanyahu to halt settlement construction. Right? Just a simple act of not building any more settlements. He wasn't insisting that he take any down. He was just saying, don't build any for a while, right? That one thing generated a backlash in the US Congress. Yeah. And this is the same period where Obama is trying to get Obamacare passed. And given the composition of the Senate, he needed every single Democratic vote to get that, right? And he quickly learned that if he continued to push Israel, he was going to lose a few senators. And he couldn't afford to lose any, right? So he had to make a decision. Do I keep pushing settlements? Yeah, he's not pushing a two-state solution yet. He's not even close to that. Just do I keep pushing Israel on settlements, or do I get Obamacare? Right? And I understand why he made the decision he made. His signature healthcare achievement would have been lost had he stuck with his guns. So he made the pragmatic deal. And that's how a lobby can exert lots of impact on a president, even when the president knows that the policies they're pushing are not what he wants, not in the best interest of the country, not in the best interest of Israel. That's how it works.
Coming back to the election, if we talk about the influence of groups like AIPAC, one highlight this year that's generated a lot of media coverage was the losses of Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush. They both lost their primaries. They're both Democrats, lost their primaries because of how much money groups like AIPAC basically spent to try and oust them or try to defeat them. Now, is this an example of why taking a pro-Israel stance is just the safe route for a lot of American politicians?
That's exactly right. And AIPAC works very hard to try and instill that. It asks every congressional candidate to fill out a questionnaire laying out what their positions are on the Middle East. And if you don't answer it properly, then they'll start directing money to your opponents as well. If you're in office and you start saying things that are critical of Israel, as the two people you mentioned did, they will immediately start looking for someone to run against you, say someone to run against you in the primary, and throw millions of dollars their way. And the key to this is you only have to do this a couple of times. If you knock off one or two congressmen this way, that sends a message to everybody else that it's not smart, that if you want to get reelected, this is not an issue you want to cross them on. And for most congressmen, they probably don't care one way or the other that much about Middle East politics, and most of their constituents don't. So they have to ask themselves, if I cross AIPAC, I might face a tough primary challenge, or I might face a tougher challenge in the general election. I won't get the money they're promising me. That money's going to go to somebody else. I don't really care one way or the other. Most of the people in my district don't care. Why should I invite this kind of a headache, this kind of a problem? So again, when going after someone like Jamal Bowman is a way of setting an example and sending a warning shot to everybody else not to get out of line, to do what we tell you to do.
But are there any indications that this kind of power or this kind of influence over the elections will shift or even weaken in the years to come?
Well, there are some members of Congress, Ilhan Omar and others, who have been able to take more critical positions. Chuck Schumer, who is as pro-Israel as they come, did give a speech on the floor of the Senate that was very critical of Netanyahu, although he's, I think, backed away from that position since then as well. You are seeing cracks in the edifice, I think is the way to put it. And the fact that this is now happening out in the open, that it's something people are talking about, that the impact that money is having on our elections is increasingly upsetting, and not just on, Israel issues, on a whole variety of issues. So I think you can see some small signs for optimism if you look forward, that people are, getting tired of this situation, but I don't think it's going to change overnight. And of course, one of the things, just add one final point, I think one of the things that really scares AIPAC most of all is that if the dam ever breaks, if we ever get to a point where congressmen don't have to be terrified, where secretaries of state and presidents don't have to be worried about not what their policy is, but how the lobby is going to react to it. All right. They understand that once people aren't afraid, then they're going to say what they think. Then the political system is going to start reflecting American public opinion. rather than the pressure that is being brought to bear by special interest groups. And so I think they work overtime. And of course, what's making it harder is that the product they're defending now, the country that they're defending, is going in the wrong direction, is acting in ways that are increasingly at odds with American values, acting in ways that are increasingly at odds with international law and with sort of basic notions of human decency. It was a much easier country to defend back when it was small and weak, seemed to be surrounded by enemies, seemed to be trying for peace as well. And even if that picture wasn't fully accurate, it was much easier to sell that picture in the 50s, 60s, even the 1970s than it is today when you see a powerful nuclear-armed Israel killing innocent civilians by the thousands. That's a real hard sell, and that's why they're worried that if they let that image take hold and they let politicians start reflecting what people are seeing, it's going to be a very different picture.
That's an interesting point about the edifice, and this is my last question. I want to end it here on this question. What do you think are the long-term consequences for U.S. foreign policy if the current relationship with Israel remains unchanged?
I think almost entirely negative, right? It's first of all going to be an increasing continued distraction. It will eat up a vast portion of every president's agenda and make it harder for him or her to focus attention on issues that are ultimately more important. It will cost us enormous standing in many parts of the world, especially in parts of the world that will be politically more important over time. It will provide lots of opportunities for China to win friends in various places by taking a more reasonable position on a variety of these questions as well. It could easily fuel a resurgence of terrorism, which would then force us to respond in various ways that will be costly and difficult. So, add it all up, as people have said for a long time, not solving the taproot of this problem, which is the Israeli-Palestinian issue, is a continued handicap for the United States. And until we have a leadership that is able to either push finally for a just settlement there or wash its hands of the problem entirely, the United States will continue to pay a large price.
And on that note, we'll leave it here. Professor Stephen Walt, thank you so much for taking the time to come on Real Talk. I appreciate it.
It was a pleasure talking with you. Those were excellent questions.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that so much.